March 5, 1963. Dyersburg, Tennessee. 7 minutes past 6 in the evening. A small yellow Piper Comanche taxis onto the runway of a tiny municipal airfield. The rain has been coming and going all day. The light is almost gone, and the airfield manager has just spent the better part of an hour trying to talk the pilot into staying the night. He offered to arrange rooms. He was turned down. There are 4 people on board. 3 of them are stars of the Grand Ole Opry. One is Patsy Cline. You know her name. If you've watched this channel before, you know her story too. But tonight isn't about Patsy. It's about the 2 men squeezed into that little cabin with her, the 2 names that history filed under, also killed in the crash. The tall one, 6'5", cowboy hat, the friendliest handshake in Nashville, is only on this plane because of a favor. 2 days ago, he handed his commercial airline ticket to a friend in trouble and took the friend's seat on this Comanche instead. He doesn't know that the single he released 3 days ago will hit #1 on the country chart, 2 weeks after his funeral. He doesn't know that his wife, 8 months pregnant, will learn about this flight from the radio. The older man beside him spent 30 years clawing his way to the top of country music, lost all of it, and 3 years ago, clawed his way back. He is 49 years old and a star for the 2nd time. He doesn't know that the pilot up front, his own son-in-law, has 13 minutes left to live. None of them do. Welcome to Country Mysteries. Let's start with the older man. Lloyd Estelle Copas was born on July 15, 1913, on a farm in Adams County, Ohio. Which was a problem, because Ohio farm boy doesn't sell tickets to a cowboy show. So for most of his career, the publicity claimed he came from Muskogee, Oklahoma. He didn't. The boots were real, the talent was real, the Oklahoma was marketing. And by the standards of 1930s show business, that still made him one of the more honest men in the room. He dropped out of school at 14 and went to work with a fiddle, playing string band dates around southern Ohio. In the mid-30s, he teamed up with a trick fiddler billed as Natchy the Indian, real name Lester Vernon Storer, a kid from the very same corner of Ohio. Together, they toured with a promoter named Larry Sunbrock, who staged fiddle contests all over the Ohio Valley. Natchy, the mysterious challenger against the beloved local champion, with young Copas backing him on guitar and singing between rounds. The contests were, to put it gently, choreographed. The outrage was real. The tickets sold. Everyone got paid. It was Copas's first lesson in the music business. The show doesn't have to be true. It has to be good. Somewhere in those years, promoters noticed something inconvenient for a fiddle act. The guitar player sang better than the fiddler fiddled. Copas started getting radio work in Cincinnati, working his way onto the big barn dance broadcasts that reached half the country. And by the end of the decade, Cowboy Copas was a name, a voice, and a hat, in roughly that order. He had a family by then, too, including a daughter named Kathy. Hold on to that name. Family is how Cowboy Copas will get the greatest comeback in country music. And family is how he'll end up in a 4-seat airplane over Tennessee. In 1943, the biggest band in country music needed a singer. Pee Wee King's Golden West Cowboys had just lost their young vocalist, a smooth operator named Eddie Arnold, off to become a superstar, and Copas got the chair. The job came with the one stage that mattered, the Grand Ole Opry. Within a few years, Copas was an Opry star in his own right, with a solo deal at King Records in Cincinnati. And then, hits. Filipino Baby, 1946, top 5. Signed, sealed, and delivered. Tennessee Waltz. Yes, he had it before Patti Page made it immortal. Candy Kisses. 'Tis sweet to be remembered. Through the late 40s, Cowboy Copas was Opry royalty, a headliner with a string of records and a warm, easy baritone that sat somewhere between a hymn and a handshake. Then the 50s arrived and took it all back. tastes moved. Honky-tonk got harder. Then Elvis happened, and the jukeboxes stopped taking requests from middle-aged men in embroidered shirts. Between 1952 and 1959, Cowboy Copas did not put one single record on the charts. Not one. The Opry kept him on the roster, but the bookings shrank to schoolhouses and small-town matinees, and the labels let him go one by one. Nashville has a specific word for a man in that position, and Nashville likes to pretend it's a kind word. The word is has-been. One person refused to file him there. Randy Hughes, a session guitarist with a salesman's motor, who had married Copas's daughter, Kathy. Hughes started managing his father-in-law, hustling bookings, knocking on doors, talking Copas back into rooms that had written him off, and got him a deal with Star Day Records. In 1960, Copas cut a song he'd written himself, a chugging, flat-picked thing called Alabama. It went to #1, and stayed. 12 weeks at the top, 34 weeks on the chart. It even crossed over onto the Pop Hot 100, the only time in his life that ever happened. Cowboy Copas was 47 years old, a decade deep into being a has-been, and suddenly, he was the biggest comeback story in country music. The follow-ups charted, the billing got big again, and the Opry crowd was his on Saturday nights. One more thing happened on the way back up. Randy Hughes, flush and ambitious, took on a second artist, a force of nature named Patsy Cline, and bought himself a used single-engine Piper Comanche. He got his pilot's license and started flying his stars to shows himself. No airline schedules, no 14-hour drives, door to door. Honestly, a perfectly rational business decision. The trouble is, aviation has a long memory for perfectly rational business decisions. Now the tall one. Harold Franklin Hawkins was born December 22, 1921, in Huntington, West Virginia, to a family that had more music in it than money. At around 13, he ran a trap line, caught 5 rabbits, and traded them for his first guitar. 5 rabbits. Adjusted for inflation, that is still the best deal anyone in this story ever made. The nickname came from a comic strip detective, Hawkshaw, and it stuck so hard that decades later, half of Nashville probably couldn't have told you his real first name. At 16, he won a talent contest and started singing on WSAZ radio in Huntington, then WCHS in Charleston. Then the war came. Hawkins spent 4 years in the Army, served in the Pacific, and along the way sang over the radio in Manila, a country boy from West Virginia, entertaining homesick G's on the far side of the world. Home from the war, he signed with King Records, the same label, the same Cincinnati building as Cowboy Copas, and built himself into a star of the radio barn dances. Years headlining the WWVA Jamboree out of Wheeling, West Virginia. Stints on RCA and Columbia, and then network television on the Ozark Jubilee. His calling cards: Sunny Side of the Mountain, Pan American, a top 10 run at Slowpoke, a big, warm voice, and a stage presence you could see from the parking lot. He stood 6 feet 5 inches tall, and the posters billed him as 11.5 yards of personality. Which is technically false, it's closer to 2 yards, but nobody ever asked for a refund. In 1955, he reached the destination, membership in the Grand Ole Opry. The charts never loved Hawkshaw quite the way live audiences did. The hits came in flurries, with long, dry gaps between them, but the man worked constantly, drew a crowd anywhere in the country, and was, by every account that survives, one of the kindest headliners in the business. Remember that. Kindness is the exact mechanism of what happens to him. And on those package show stages, he kept crossing paths with a 5'1" honky-tonk singer from Pauls Valley, Oklahoma, with a voice that could strip paint off a barn. Her name was Jean Shepard. Jean Shepard was nobody's +1. She'd hit #1 in 1953 with A Dear John Letter, her duet with Ferlin Husky, when she was still a teenager. By November 1955, she was in the Grand Ole Opry cast, at a time when the only other women on that roster were Kitty Wells and Minnie Pearl. On any given chart week, Jean Shepard was arguably the bigger record act in this couple. History mostly forgot to mention that, too. History's been doing a lot of that in this episode. Hawkshaw and Jean married in November 1960, on stage, mid-show, at an auditorium in Wichita, Kansas, in front of roughly 4,000 paying witnesses. Why on stage? Jean explained it herself years later. He wanted to be married on stage. Do you believe that? Because he loved Hank Williams, and Hank Williams had been married on stage. So it was a beautiful wedding, in front of about 4,000 people. I had a lot of witnesses. Modeling your wedding on Hank Williams is a deeply country music decision. Hank is the greatest who ever lived, and also a man who didn't see 30. Pick your role models by category, folks. In December 1961, their first son arrived, Don Robin, named, the story goes, for their friends Don Gibson and Marty Robbins. The Hawkins household was, by Nashville standards, almost suspiciously happy. 2 Opry members, 1 baby, a farm outside town, horses that Hawkshaw trained himself. In 1962, he went back to King Records, the label of his first hits, looking for one more real run at the charts. Justin Tubb, Ernest Tubb's son, had the song. Lonesome 77203, a heartbreak number about a man who sits by the telephone night after night, waiting for a call from a woman who is gone. Hawkins heard it and knew. He cut it, King shipped it that winter, and friends said his excitement over the record was second only to his excitement over the other news in the house. Jean was pregnant again, due in the spring. Lonesome 7-7203 entered the Billboard Country Chart on March 2, 19 schedule. Hawkshaw Hawkins had 3 days left. In January 1963, a Kansas City disc jockey known as Cactus Jack Call was killed in, of all things, a car crash. Call was one of those DJs that country acts owed favors to. He spun their records, plugged their tours, made their lives easier in his market for years. So Nashville decided to pass the hat properly. A benefit for his family was set for Sunday, March 3rd, at Memorial Hall in Kansas City, Kansas. Nobody took a fee, and everybody covered their own travel. File that detail away. Covered their own travel is the hinge this entire story turns on. The bill was stacked. Cowboy Copas, Hawkshaw Hawkins, Billy Walker, Dottie West, George Jones, and closing the night, Patsy Cline, who had flown in with Randy Hughes in the Comanche, was fighting a heavy cold and sang 3 shows anyway. If you've seen episode 1 of this channel, you know what that winter had been like for Patsy. For months, she'd been telling friends she didn't expect to live long. She'd started giving her personal things away. She had written out her will on Delta Airlines stationery, an airline notepad. I try to keep this show skeptical, but some details are simply too on the nose for fiction. Monday, March 4th, the weather slammed shut. Rain, wind, low cloud, the Comanche wasn't going anywhere, and the artists holed up at the Townhouse Motor Hotel. That's where the goodbyes got rearranged. Dottie West, who never trusted small planes, pleaded with Patsy to skip the flight and ride home to Nashville in the car with her and her husband. 16 hours of highway. Patsy waved it off. "Don't worry about me, Hoss. When it's my time to go, it's my time." And Billy Walker got a phone call at that hotel. Back home, his father had suffered a heart attack. Walker needed to leave immediately, and the fastest thing out of Kansas City was a commercial airline seat. Hawkshaw Hawkins had one. He handed it over. The way Walker told it for the rest of his life, "Here, kid, you be Hawkshaw Hawkins on that plane tomorrow morning, and I'll take your place on the private plane." In fairness, some retellings flipped the offer, that it was Walker who asked for the swap, rather than Hawkins who volunteered. Either way, the ticket changed hands. And so did the seat on the Comanche. So here is the manifest, settled in a hotel lobby. Randy Hughes at the controls, his father-in-law, Cowboy Copas, beside him, Patsy Cline and Hawkshaw Hawkins in the back. A private pilot with no instrument rating, a 4-seat airplane, and a cold front parked on top of Tennessee. Tuesday, March 5th. Around 2 in the afternoon, the weather cracks open just enough, and the Comanche lifts out of Fairfax Airport in Kansas City. First leg to Rogers, Arkansas. Refuel, back in the air within minutes. At 5:05 p.m., they set down at Dyersburg, Tennessee, roughly 90 miles from home. Last stop. Top off the tanks. Check the weather. The briefing is bad. Low ceilings, rain, gusting wind across the route ahead, and the sun going down. The airfield manager suggests more than once that they stay the night. By his later account, he offered to arrange rooms himself. Patsy, standing near the flight service station, was overheard leaving the decision to her manager. If you want to stay, we'll stay. If you want to go, we'll go. Randy Hughes answered the manager instead, and the answer became one of the most quoted sentences in country music history. I've already come this far. We'll be there before you know it. At 6:07 p.m., the Comanche took off into the dark. What happened next is a textbook case. Literally, flight instructors still teach it. A pilot rated only for visual flying enters cloud and rain at night. No horizon, no ground lights. The inner ear begins telling confident lies. You feel level while you're banking. You feel like you're climbing while you're headed down. And the only cure is a skill this pilot didn't have. Trust the panel, not your body. The instruments in that airplane were working fine. The training to believe them was the one thing not on board. At approximately 6:20 p.m., the Piper came out of the overcast, nose down, and hit the forest west of Camden, Tennessee. All 4 on board were killed instantly. A wristwatch recovered from the site, Patsy's by most accounts, had stopped at exactly 6:20. Through the night, radio stations carried reports of a plane missing between Dyersburg and Nashville, and the country community did what it always does. It drove toward the trouble. Search parties combed the Benton County woods in the rain and the dark. By his own account, a young songwriter named Roger Miller was among the first to reach the scene as the sky turned gray. On the morning of March 6th, the wreckage was confirmed. What the searchers found scattered through those trees, I'll leave in the official reports. Nashville, 90 miles east, went quiet. And then, and this is the part even country fans forget, the dying kept going. On Thursday, March 7th, Nashville began the services. Thousands filed past. The Grand Ole Opry cast had been hollowed out overnight. The next morning, Friday, March 8th, Jack Anglin, one half of the hit duo Johnny and Jack, an Opry fixture for years, attended the joint services for Cowboy Copas and Randy Hughes. Then the memorial for Hawkshaw Hawkins. Then stopped for a haircut before Patsy Cline's memorial service. The haircut made him late. Rushing along New Due West Avenue in Madison, Tennessee, his car left the road and struck a tree. He died instantly. A country star killed on the way to a country star's funeral 3 days after the crash. He was 46. And March 1963 still wasn't finished. On the 29th, Texas Ruby, one of the Opry's pioneering women, half of the act Curly Fox and Texas Ruby, died in a fire in the couple's Nashville house trailer while her husband was across town playing the Friday night Opry. Count it however you like. Within 24 days, the Opry family had buried 5 of its own. March 1963 remains the darkest single month in country music history, and it is not close. Then the charts delivered a twist no screenwriter would dare hand in. 2 weeks after the crash, Lonesome 77203, the song about a man waiting by a telephone for a call that never comes, went to #1 on the Billboard country chart. It stayed there 4 weeks. It was the first #1 of Hawkshaw Hawkins' 25-year career and the biggest record he ever made. He never heard 1 second of that success. On April 8, 1963, 34 days after the crash, Jean Shepard gave birth to a boy and named him Harold Franklin Hawkins II. Then she went back to work. She raised 2 sons largely on the road, put more than 70 singles on the country charts, stood on the grand old Opry stage for 60 consecutive years, the longest tenure of any woman in Opry history, and entered the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2011. She died in 2016. If you ever need a definition of country music toughness, a widow with a newborn and a toddler back under the lights within months, hitting every note. That's the definition. Cowboy Copas was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Gardens in Goodlettsville, Tennessee, next to Randy Hughes, the son-in-law who handed him back his career. And then, with no malice in him and no instrument rating on him, took the rest. And Billy Walker, the man who lived because a tall friend handed him a ticket, he carried that debt gracefully for 43 years. More hits, decades on the Opry, a working musician to the very end. In May 2006, driving home through the night from a show in Alabama, Billy Walker was killed in a crash on Interstate 65. Country music does not write neat endings. It writes true ones. Every story about March 5, 1963 begins and ends with Patsy Cline, and fair enough. She was one of the greatest voices this music ever produced. But also on board is a lousy epitaph for 2 men who were headliners in their own right. One was a farm kid who played a cowboy so well he outlasted the costume, went from has-been to 12 straight weeks at #1 at 47, and died at the top for the 2nd time in his life. The other traded 5 rabbits for a guitar, gave a friend his plane ticket because that's simply who he was, and earned a #1 record he never lived to hear. Remember the names: Cowboy Copas, Hawkshaw Hawkins. If you haven't seen it yet, episode 1 of this show covers Patsy's side of that night, the premonitions, the will written on airline stationery, the stopped watch. The 2 episodes pair like a double A-side. Next time on Country Mysteries, a baby blue Cadillac rolling through a frozen New Year's night, a teenage chauffeur behind the wheel, and 6 missing hours at the end of Hank Williams' life, the coldest cold case this music has ever produced. If stories like this are your kind of thing, subscribing takes 1 click and costs 5 rabbits less than a guitar. I've been Roman. Thanks for watching, and check the weather before you fly. Cheers.